Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2017 NCSA plenary session. Our session begins now.
So when I talked to John yesterday, we mentioned we were going to talk about high school assessments today, and I'm pumped up about this. I know that means I'm an assessment nerd, but I'm super excited to talk to these four folks about high school assessment and what does the future look like for us around high school. At CCSSO, you guys know we have our plan, a strategic plan for the organization that has actually just been refreshed, and we've set a 3-year goal for ourselves of making sure kids are ready for college, career, and life at a higher rate than they are right now. But that led us to a conversation with our board of directors about what metric we should use to define that. And they were very interested in us going and looking at metrics nationally for high schools, especially. And that led us to a conversation about whether NAEP is a good metric at the high school level, whether we want to use SAT or ACT metrics, or we want to use like state assessments and progress in the states on the state assessments. We also looked at AP and IB, along with maybe career readiness certifications. So that list is a pretty long list of potential things that we could judge ourselves on about whether we're being successful with kids as they leave high school. It left us with this challenge, and it actually led to us wanting to have this conversation today. We don't necessarily right now have a good metric for how we're doing at the high school level with our kids. We know remediation rates. That's another possible metric. So I'm really interested in digging in to some of these conversations. I think one thing that it came up in our discussions is how do we know that these metrics are comparable from state to state? Obviously, if SAT and ACT are part of that conversation, they would be comparable. But how do you make sure that as you are judging our success across the states, things like graduation rate come into that conversation as well? So as I was preparing to sort of give this opening, I made a list of 10 or 15 things we could use. And I think we're not being fair to our kids in high schools with the way we're assessing them right now. And I think that is a pretty consistent opinion across our membership. So how do we, as the folks who are responsible for assessment in the country, how do we get back to a place or create a new position in the country where high school assessments are value add for kids and also give us the information we need to judge how we're doing with high schools. So that's going to be what we're going to talk about today. Salam, I want to start with you. Thank you for being with us, a chief in Oregon. So you guys recently made a decision to go to a high school, to change your high school assessment. Can you talk about what went into that and tell folks what you guys have decided to do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris, for having us here today. I think for Oregon, we've decided to explore alternative options at the high school level, and that was really born out of the flexibility that's been afforded to us by the Every Student Succeeds Act. And it's a decision that's based on a number of variables. One is this flexibility that allows us to explore other options that we know students tend to gravitate to, and educators in our state tend to assign a great deal of value to. And it's part of the national debate on assessments and the value of the assessment, its relevance to the student, its relevance to their future, and that next step, especially at the high school level. So for us, we've had this conversation about directions to go, and the decision that we've made is to explore other options for high school assessment, such as SAT, ACT, and others that may actually be out there. We're approaching this very methodically. We did a request for information, and we did receive a couple of responses from providers. And the next step for us is to do a request for proposal. Our goal is to ensure that we have a quality, valid, and reliable assessment that serves our needs and adds value to this exercise in our state, especially at the high school level. So we're approaching very carefully and methodically, and it's something that seems to resonate greatly with policymakers. Our legislators are interested in seeing us go in a different direction. It's something that resonates with educators because they want to make sure that students are accessing an assessment that adds value to their high school experience and leads to other opportunities beyond high school as a college entrance exam, for example. So we're exploring all of those things, and this seems to generate a lot of enthusiasm and excitement on the one hand, especially with parents, students, communities, policymakers. I think the assessment folks are a bit nervous about it because there's a lot of unknown, and the current assessment, ours is SBAC, is a quality, reliable, and tested assessment. So we have to proceed very carefully and thoughtfully, but we feel that we owe it to our education system to explore these options and opportunities.
Is it a non-negotiable for you to have a connection, or for it to be a college entrance exam, or is that not one of the things you're putting in your RFP?
Well, we're interested in having the assessment provide a reportable score.
Okay.
So that is, I mean, at this time, I can't tell you for sure if it's a non-negotiable, but it's an item that we're very highly interested in as part of this process.
Good. Sorry to put you on the spot.
And that's based on the feedback that we've gathered from our stakeholders and our communities around the state.
Got it. So Chris, could you talk, we spent all this energy working on consortia assessments, and now there seems to be going the other direction in high school a bit, I would say. We have more than 10 states who have chosen ACT or SAT as their the high school assessment. So what do you think is causing that? What are the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think, I don't want to bury the lead. I think the most important thing I'd say in response to the diminishing consortia support is that the consortia absolutely accomplished some really positive, really important things that have moved assessment forward in this country. I think the reasons for the departure from the consortia are many. Maybe none of them are more important or more influential than the political winds that blew and it changed the temperament and the priorities of some of the policymakers making those decisions. I think in other cases there were real differences of vision in the state leaders in terms of maybe design choices or operational choices of those assessments, and I wouldn't for a moment minimize that. I think that maybe an interaction of multiple factors in some cases. But I don't think the states abandoned the principles that they were committed to in 2010, 2012, when we still saw very robust membership across the two general assessment consortia. Two of those were a commitment to measuring college and career-ready standards. So we're seeing high school assessments that are, I think, credibly pegged to the academic knowledge and skills associated with college success. There's some improvement that can be made, but I think we've moved the ball forward in that respect. And I think the other dimension is a performance standard that really is located at a place that is credible and that is realistically associated with the level of achievement that's needed in order to have a high probability of succeeding in an entry-level credit-bearing college course. So I think we've moved the ball forward because of the work with the consortium, and I'm buoyed by some of the work that states continue to do that have dropped out of the consortium. So yesterday I had a presentation with state leaders from Louisiana, Michigan, and Massachusetts, and they talked about some of the innovations that they've brought to their state programs because of their involvement in the consortia and how they're leveraging aspects both that are reflective of state-specific priorities and things that they were able to add as contributions because of what the consortium has to offer and what they bring. So I have an optimistic view of the role of the consortium, but yeah, I think states are beginning to see that there are ways that they can accomplish their vision outside of the consortia while still maintaining their commitment to the priorities and leveraging some of the good work.
Quick follow-up. So do you think, are we actually trying to measure something different in a high school test versus a college entrance exam? So from the technical side of building these tests, is that a worry of yours as we go down this path?
No, I think that's the area that we have to continue to emphasize is, what are the set of academic knowledge and skills that are really most important to incentivize and measure? I do think there are some differences, which is why it's not a layup to just assume that these national assessments can be appropriate stand-in for what the consortia have done. But is that a divide that can be bridged? I think that's something we're going to see very soon.
Great. So Andrew, you're on the NAEP governing board, and thank you for your service on that group. It's a good group. Could you talk a little bit about 12th grade NAEP and where that is, sort of give us a landscape of that, and then also tell us if you think that could be a potential measure that we could look at.
Yes, absolutely. So you were mentioning this list of metrics from which you could possibly choose, and I was trying to think of a good metaphor for them. And menu is not the right one because they're so different and they each serve different purposes, right? So the metaphor I think is better like a toolbox. Right? We have a bunch of different metrics. They're good for certain things. Let's figure out what they're useful for and who they're useful for and for what. And NAEP, grade 12 NAEP is one of them. It's been around for a long time. The last assessment was in 2015, but only at a national level. In 2013, I think we had 13 states participate. In 2009, we had maybe 9, 11. And so this has been a light touch relatively, right? We sample. We don't measure everybody, as you know. But I do think it's a very useful, long-term, stable approach to measuring progress in academic achievement in reading and mathematics. So if you think about the toolbox again, it's good for that purpose. And I think there are some useful questions we could ask. For example, should we be measuring beyond reading and mathematics and 12th grade? Should we be measuring in 12th grade? Because the idea of 12th grade is changing over time, increasing graduation rates. That grade of students means something different, right? So I absolutely think it should be a tool in the toolbox, and then we should think about what else we could sort of put under the NAEP umbrella, if anything, right? What is NAEP's relative strength? Long-term stability, measurement of trends over time, right? How can we tell if we're making progress if commissioners are changing frequently and policies are changing frequently? All the winds of change come through, NAEP stays fairly stable. So it's very useful for that purpose.
That's great.
So again, I think there are questions to be asked about when to measure and how much to measure. And then I think we should think about how NAEP should partner with states, perhaps increase state participation at the state level in NAEP so that we can increase its value. And we can also say maybe NAEP isn't the best place to measure certain things, right? If a non-negotiable is an individual reported score, NAEP is not the right tool, right? So I think we should see NAEP as a key tool in the toolbox that's good for some key things, and think about whether or not to have more tools in that sort of NAEP bundle, or whether to use different schools, use different tools rather, at the state level for certain other purposes, such as individual level reporting, fast feedback to teachers, right? Fast feedback to school leaders. So I think there are a lot of important purposes to align with the metrics that you list.
So with 13 states, though, we don't have half the country doing it yet. So that would be obviously part of what we would need to change if high schools or if we wanted to judge our success there, correct?
For that purpose, right? So if we didn't have some national test where every single student, we want to understand if we're making progress in academic achievement in this country and different across states, and see if we're closing academic achievement gaps.
Great.
That's an incredibly important question to be answered. The question is whether we should answer that with NAEP or with potentially other tests that have lots of buy-in.
So I have a lot of follow-ups, but I'll come back to you. We also have cards. I was supposed to tell you this. You have cards in the middle of your table. If you're interested in asking a question, write it down, hold it up. Someone will come pick it up from you and deliver it to me, and I get to decide whether we ask that question. So make it a good one. Linda, what would be your long-term vision for high school assessment? You've done so much work on performance assessment, and I have a feeling that that's part of what you'll talk about, so please do. But how could we set ourselves on a pathway for 5 to 10 years from now having a different set of assessments in high school?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking as we were going around that, comparability is an important goal, but the even bigger goal is having kids who are college and career ready in the 21st century.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Critical thinking, problem solving, communication. We're in an era where in the 4 years between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the history of the world preceding. Technology knowledge is doubling every 11 months. So having kids sit and find one right answer out of 5 is not actually encouraging the kind of preparation that they're going to need for the world that they're going into. And it's a practical decision and a good one to motivate kids to want to take the tests to choose an SAT or an ACT. But I would say that if you're not at least including the writing component, you're not measuring college and career ready. because, you know, a score on just a multiple choice test cannot predict. In California, the UC system looked at the predictive validity of the SAT and found that class rank and grade point average did better than any of the SAT tests to predict success in the first year of college and the fourth year of college and graduation. But the only predictive part was the SAT-2 writing test, or the SAT essay, because it's a little closer to what you actually have to do in college. So authenticity, getting to what you actually have to do in college and careers on our assessments, is going to be very important. I think it's one of the reasons that 900 colleges are now test optional, more than 900 in the United States. We had a meeting recently with a group of higher education institutions, and some of the colleges, places like MIT, are now encouraging portfolio submissions. The University of Michigan, the business school, only accepts portfolio submissions of actual student work. And universities are asking, well, how do we get access to real student work? Is it a digital portfolio? Is there some accreditation system? Is it like the International Baccalaureate Program, which is a set of experiences that include projects and papers that are scored by classroom teachers and sent out to other International Baccalaureate teachers and scored with moderation and come back and add up with sit-down tests to both a program of study that is really intellectually rich, demanding. It is the gold standard in assessment based on a study that Rand did of the depth of knowledge measured. But it also, how many of you have experience with the IB program? So a bunch of hands have gone up. So, and tell your neighbor if they didn't raise their hand, what I'm talking about. But it's actually designed around inquiry skills, knowledge production skills, the capacity to problem solve collaboratively and individually in the content areas and interdisciplinarily in ways that really do translate to what you're going to do in college, what you're going to do in careers. That's actually the model for examinations in many countries. The UK, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia have examination systems which are partly performance in scientific investigations, research papers, and some sit-down tests, usually open-ended, from the British diaspora, which kind of sent the blue books around the world. now they're on computers. They combine those scores, but it's organized around a program of study where you know where you're heading. And kids actually get to decide which exams they're going to take. They say, I want to qualify in art, math, and French or English or whatever. They could take a bunch or a few. The information goes to employers, it goes to colleges. So a system in which we can have kids doing authentic work that counts towards what is going to travel with them beyond high school. To Salam's point, it's got to be meaningful to the students. It's got to count for what you're actually aiming for, in which we also engage the higher education community, the employer community, so that the work is usable. Interestingly, the thing I would use right now, if I had to, is the AP capstone examination. They've got a 2-year course of study, which was created because colleges came to the AP, to the College Board, and said, we want something that has kids engaged in critical thinking, problem solving, writing, communication. Teachers learn how to score this 2-year research seminar and capstone project. And if you got a 5 on that, or for maybe a 4 or a 3, I would say you've had a lot more of the experiences that prepare you for college and for career than sitting down one afternoon and taking an SAT or an ACT, which you could cram for and prep for, but it would not actually require the same kind of authentic skills.
Linda, so following up on that, how do we have to change the expectations in colleges before we can change that? Because it seems to me, I think most parents right now are still thinking ACT and SAT if their kids are going to college. So how do we shift that Do we have to shift on the demand side first or on the supply side, or what do you think happens
It's an interesting
first?
question, and I think it's kind of shifting simultaneously on both sides. You've got 17 states now require or encourage some kind of capstone project or portfolio of demonstration of essential skills or whatever it might be. On the other hand, you've got 900 colleges going test optional, but they're actively saying what else are ways that we can get information about what kids can do. The ACE, the NACAC, and other organizations that represent colleges are actively having conversations about how could we get this evidence. It casts a big shadow. SAT and ACT are there because most colleges still accept them and value them. But the fact that they went to the College Board and said, invent something new for us,
Right.
invent something that has kids doing this, suggests that there may be both a demand side shift happening, and meanwhile, a lot of schools are trying to create, and states are trying to create these opportunities to supply more
Great.
challenging kinds of work.
Yeah. Salam, you said backstage that you're trying to make this test less the focus of everything, and that you don't want this high school test to be the one thing. Talk a little bit about why that is and how you're actually, there's some other things you're doing too with graduation and other things that are really important, I think, around the idea, how do we know we're being successful in high school?
Right. So I think the challenge that we have is that we often start with the accountability conversation. So even as we talk about these tests and we try to make them relevant and meaningful and measure the things that Linda so eloquently described, we have this illusion that they do, but in actuality they really don't. And they get reduced to an event that occurs at the end of the school year where everybody takes the same test, and we assume that everybody is being measured on the same knowledge and skills, or is going to be able to demonstrate their equal proficiency of knowledge and skills. So even with ACT, SAT, or any other option that's available, we have to be careful to not fall into the same trap and assume that this test is going to measure all of these things and it's going to be better than the other test. We, in our state, and this is something that I've been using lately, is that we need to start the conversation with learning. So learning is everything that Linda described. And learning then leads you to teaching, and when you start talking about teaching and learning, then the assessment can come into play, and you can figure out the purpose of the assessment, the purpose of that test, and who's actually administering that test. And with student agency, the students could actually be in charge of that process as well. So I think we just need to work through all of these different dynamics to this and understand that a test for accountability is going to measure it's a basic set of knowledge and skills that we expect all students to know and be able to do. But if we can make it more value add and create a path for them towards something that they can aspire to, or their families can aspire to for them, then something like SAT that has a value with the college or the post-secondary institution that they're going to go to has that value add. I think when I think about testing in general, it's really, the underlying assumption is that we want to use this to inform instruction. We want to use this assessment, whether it's a formative, interim, or a summative, but we tend to focus primarily on the summative, to change practice. And the way to change practice, in my opinion, is through promoting these authentic learning experiences that we measure in different ways. And we don't rely on a single instrument to tell us whether the students have mastered the knowledge and have the skills required for success. Linda mentioned essential skills. In our state, students have to, we have 9 essential skills, but students have to demonstrate proficiency in 3 of those, which is reading, writing, and math in order to graduate. And that can be demonstrated through meeting a particular score on the state assessment, on SBAC, but we've created multiple pathways for students to demonstrate their proficiency on the essential skills. And that could be through in-school experiences, out-school experiences, work samples, projects and activities that they can engage in that are aligned to the content standards, demonstration of proficiency on other assessments that they take. It could be a college entrance exams, it could be based on their performance on the SAT, ACT. That personalizes the learning experience for the student, and it creates multiple pathways for them to demonstrate their proficiency. So I think for us, we really have to think about this broadly, and I think we're still thinking about it within the parameters that have been established for us under the auspices of accountability. So it makes it challenging sometimes, because I know that an SAT or ACT is not going to bring about the change that we want to see in our schools and a change in practice, but it may inch us closer to that if the students see value and relevance, and it leads to an outcome that everybody can subscribe to and support.
So quick follow-up on that. Do you think kids see more value in the ACT and the SAT than they do with the state test in Oregon?
I believe they do, and I attribute that to a couple of things, actually. I attribute some of, I alluded a little bit to the national debate that we're currently engaged in relative to testing, over-testing, testing fatigue, the relevance of the testing or the assessments that we offer. But I think to our credit as a nation, we have matured tremendously with regards to assessments and the purpose of assessments. I think we've built capacity in our states and our schools around balanced assessment systems. So teachers are asking for different types of assessments to measure student proficiency that are related to their instruction that they can act on right away. Yeah. So I think there is maturity on the part of the profession. And I also think our students today are a lot more savvy. Yeah. I have 4 kids. 2 of them could care less about the assessment. Yeah. The younger 2, they're like of a different generation. They actually compete with their friends on the assessment. If their friends have a score and it's insignificant, maybe 1 or 2 points higher, they want to retake the test because it means something to them. So I think students are a lot more savvy. In our state, maybe we'll get into this later, students have the option to opt out of the state assessment. And we're seeing them gravitate more towards SAT and ACT. And some districts had made that option available to all of their high school seniors, as a matter of fact. So I think students see the value in the assessment, and they're making a choice, making a deliberate choice.
Well, if they have to take it anyway, right, then it's an efficiency, right?
Right.
Yeah.
If they're going to take it en route to college.
We'll come back to the opt-out piece. Salam, did you just tell your kids that you're the state commissioner and they have to take the test?
No, I did tell them they have to take the test,
okay.
yes. Yes,
I can see the headline.
That was a long debate in our household.
Opt-out denied.
That's right. Andrew, would you thinking about the list of accountability or possible metrics at the high school level that I ran through, if you were sitting in a state, what types of things would you be drawn towards if you were designing a high school accountability system? And do you think matrix sampling could be part of such a thing?
We were joking backstage about having a whiteboard right here, so we could diagram everything out. I think
these folks are going to want to hear it. Get it going.
That would be useful. Speaking of tools, I think matrix sampling is back on the table. It can't be the only thing that we do, but it's definitely in this era where we envision this testing burden, right? It's definitely in the way NAEP does a way to solve a lot of different problems, right? So I think that's absolutely back on the table. But at the same time, there's still going to be a demand for individual scores because that's what students and parents and teachers are looking for. But that's where you do have some opportunity to be a little bit more flexible in the way that Linda was imagining and go deeper on some of these individual in some of these assessments than we currently are. So again, I just think making sure you have the right tool for certain purposes is key. So the accountability question is also key because again, where Linda was bringing up the IB as an example, right? That's a case where if we start to get teacher accountability and school accountability into a system like IB, and then think about possible corruption of those measures when you might rely a little bit more on local scoring, or there are some concerns that I have in that regard. So again, I think like a matrix sampling approach for accountability, while also having like deep individual assessments in other cases, could be a nice sort of 1-2 or tools for the right purposes. I also think we need to think a lot more carefully about in this opt-out era, about being useful and making sure that when we're talking about testing, we're not thinking about the product, we're thinking this booklet or this set of experiences, we're thinking about what people do with the results and how they act on them, right? I think a lot of the issues that we're having around testing right now it comes from the feeling that it is done to us and that there is no ultimate gain from it, right? So, why would a student care? Why would a teacher care? Why would a school leader care? And so there's a way in which I think we have to think less about the product as a test, but a product as a set of decisions that arises from a measurement procedure, a set of actions that we can take in response to the information that we spent days investing our kids and our teachers' time in. And I think we need to steer into that very deliberately about how is the information that comes from this going to be made useful to you, and by which I mean students and parents and school leaders and the public, right? And I think that's where, when we sort of see that, I think, in this room, as yes, of course, that's what we're talking about when we talk about testing. But that's certainly not what the public is hearing. And so I think that there's a lot of ways in which we need to focus much more on how people receive the information and the actions that they can take from it and feel empowered with the information, as opposed to simply having it done to us from some
and
extent.
our answer to why should all those people care needs to evolve from because we're going to threaten them with some kind of punishment to something that actually is informative and productive for the teaching and learning process. And I think we have an opportunity to do more of that now than might have been the case a couple of years ago. And it's important to kind of seize that. What might be really motivating to Salam's kids who have to take I'm worried about them now, who have to take the tests, may not be the same thing that is what the public wants to get out of a test, which is why this mixed toolbox is so important, how to use, things like matrix sampling to get richer, deeper information from the kind of tasks we'd like to see kids doing, while at the same time having kids involved in things that are motivating and engaging for them. And informative to employers, colleges, et cetera.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think we've done a really good job developing a college-going culture in our schools around the country, not just in Oregon. And we promoted this sense for kids that you do these things because there is a reward that's associated with them. So we have more kids taking AP courses, we have more kids and parents gravitating toward IB schools, we have kids wanting to credential in CTE programs and areas because they see the value, and it's what you alluded to earlier, that this leads to something, it leads to somewhere. So kids are really savvy nowadays, and they understand the value of a state test, especially for kids that have been in our system for the last 15, 16 years. They've been taking state tests every year. They know what it is, they know what it means, and they have also felt the impact of it, and in some instances, none. So I think kids are a lot more savvy, and kids are looking for more opportunities that will lead to credentialing and opportunities that will pay off down the road. So I think what I hear Linda saying is that we need to personalize the learning experiences for students, and the assessments need to also be personalized and customized to the individual needs. And we still need a tool for accountability, but we're trying to use the accountability tool to measure all of those things, or get the system to behave in a way that it's just not going to the degree that we want.
Definitely officially lost control of the panel, so that's great. Let's just go and do this. So, Chris, and the only NCLB, it's now ESSA. ESSA requires one test in high school in reading and math. So other than that requirement, do you think we need a common assessment in high schools across the country of reading and math, or what would you do if you didn't have that requirement?
Yeah, I like the question, Chris, and I think this plays on the conversation that was just tapering off here. That I think to answer that question really forces us to crystallize what our priorities are. And it makes me think about the old quip about if you want an assessment, everybody wants an assessment that's good, fast, and cheap. Pick one, maybe two if you're lucky. So I think we have to be very clear about.
I'd like to opt out of that statement.
How cheap are the IDs again?
I think we have to be very clear about what the purpose of the assessment is and how we're going to use it. A lot of these great ideas that I'm hearing, and I'm in agreement with my colleagues, are really outside of the summative assessment world. They're outside of the accountability world, but it is also a world that exists now, and I think people are really laboring under the criteria and the requirements of that. So, I think we were seeing states do good work in improving their high school assessments, as I mentioned from the lead in this conversation. And I don't think that that you have to necessarily have a really impoverished test to have a summative assessment. I think we can have good tests. We're moving in that direction. We have some work to do. I agree that writing ought to be a prominent part of assessments. I think there's some easy calls for how we can get some high quality. I would be reluctant to move away from a common assessment, and I didn't say I would be opposed to it, but I would be reluctant and careful. And part of that is what I call the public trust argument, and part of that is also an equity argument. So I think that the public trust that we're going to provide clear, unambiguous, uncomplicated information back to policymakers and stakeholders about how our kids are doing. And I think if we create conditions that complicate that too much, we do so at our own peril. So that we isolate purpose for summative assessments in an accountability world so that they're no more onerous than they have to be. I know that's easy to say, really hard to do. I acknowledge that even as I say it, but certainly good enough to send credible signals about readiness. But really, many of the reforms I hear my colleagues talk about, I think, are outside of the summative world, they're outside of the accountability world, and it's about building capacity and equipping professionals to do this good work.
So quickly, would you want more testing in high school? Would you want a 9th grade test? Would you want a 10th grade test? Like, do you think, what's the right balance here?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that question. I think more summative testing, almost certainly no.
Okay.
More good practice in the classroom, more innovation in the LEAs in schools, absolutely. And an interesting aspect of that is what's the state's role there? And I don't think the answer is the state's role is to come up with plug-and-play solutions that they're just going to push downhill and it's going to work for everybody. I think the state should think carefully about what's their role to push this innovation, to build capacity, creating illustrations of effective practices, building capacity, putting money towards professional development, rewarding schools that are doing this well. I mean, I think all of those are examples of how we improve practice at scale without this being an environment, as Andrew was saying, where things are just done to them.
Got it.
And just, it sounds like you're describing New Hampshire to some extent. It may not be what was at the front of your mind, but it sounded like a good description of it, where teachers are working to create performance tasks with a lot of help, with a lot of professional development, figuring out how to use those locally, but then there are common tasks used across schools and districts with carefully moderated scoring where you can make some comparisons with how kids are doing. But all of that work that the kids are engaged in feels like learning and teaching.
Absolutely.
It's instructional. They're doing the kinds of projects and tasks that really engage them and enable them to develop the skills. And it's a blend of what can be used formatively and summatively by virtue of building that local capacity. And then, do the NAEP if you want to compare the states, right?
We just need all the states to opt in.
Do you want to get in on this?
Well, yeah. I mean, if I were forced to ask, I would. If I were forced to answer the question of whether there should be more testing, I think
you are forced to answer.
I was setting myself up. I think I would say.
For a second of
That's right. I think I'm never going to be concerned about that. I think the answer is yes. I would want more testing, but for what, right? And I think this is where what Linda was describing in IB is, I mean, there are assessments, but it's a curriculum, right?
Yes.
It's a coherent,
learning.
cohesive, coordinated curriculum, and I think that's what we need sort of first and foremost within states, and we can get to across states later, but certainly within states on the assessment side, and also obviously the curriculum side, more coordination, more cohesiveness among the assessments, and that's really what you were describing, Salam, right? You were describing a system where one could choose from different assessments, but then how do you how do you tell from those how do you raise that up to the level of school accountability? That's a coordination question, right, and a comparability question, and that's what I think is a very hard problem to solve. But full employment for psychometricians is
It's
one of
a
those.
high priority. But
solutions.
the more assessments we have in our culture, the lower quality they tend to be, because we have this price point idea, which is that, we can't spend more than $10 or $20 a kid on a test, which is about 0.2% of what we spend on average for education. And yet it's the tail wagging the dog. And so if we say, well, it's got to be, that price point in it, that pushes us most of the time to selected response modalities, then the more we test, the more we're pushing away from the kind of work that we're talking about here. If you think about the other countries that have assessment systems that look like the IB, they're curriculum-based and have these components and so on, and where their kids, study after study shows that high school kids from countries that, like the ones I'm talking about, come here and think the high school curriculum is way beneath them, that they've already done so much more and been challenged so much more to think and perform. They're spending a couple of $100s on the IB to do all of that assessment, because teachers are scoring it inside the school and outside the school and all that. But they're getting a tremendous amount of learning and capacity out of it. So we have to start thinking about, what are we willing to spend to invest in the right kind of instruction, curriculum assessment that actually gets kids ready for the world they're going into, rather than how much can I get in my state budget, with a cap of $20 a kid, which will never get us there.
Right, it's not a cost of a test per kid. It's you're investing in these learning pathways that happen to involve assessments, right?
And a lot of what you're investing in is also teachers' teachers' engagement in scoring, et cetera. But some states, the New York Regents are an example, have used professional development days for teachers to score assessments for hundreds of years. They brought it from England, which is where that.
England, wow. I didn't know that about that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And actually, that modality is what England exported to its colonies. You notice all the places I named were part of the
13, yes, okay.
colonial empire.
So this is the second time in 2 days that somebody on this stage is advocating spending more on tests at a testing conference. That's good. Linda,
Good
follow.
tests.
Yeah, it's good. John did it yesterday too. So you and Jean Wilhoit wrote a paper about 51st State, sort of what a system might look like. You talked a little bit about high school testing in there and what that might look like. Could you talk a little bit about what you guys were describing there together and what that might look like for a state that would want
I
to?
might need to ask for Jean's
Yeah,
help.
well,
but
we might need Jean to come out too. But
you could add on. So we talked about, first of all, doing standardized tests just once in a grade span, so that you have a way to validate the work that's going on with local assessments. That may also be common and may be used across the state. When Jean was commissioner in Kentucky, they had math performance tasks and a writing portfolio, which teachers, which had sort of expectations for the kind of writing you put into it. Teachers scored it with audits and checks, as they do on the New York Regents exams, and got very, very good at scoring very, very reliably. So those kinds of ideas, that there would be these performance assessments, there would be a check on it with standardized testing periodically, but not all the time. And that's essentially very close to the design that New Hampshire has. And then at the high school level, you would then really have kids involved in using both common tasks and locally developed tasks, much like you do with the essential skills in Oregon, adding up to a capstone experience, which actually happens also to be part of the current New Hampshire plan. Right. And then if you can figure out how to just take what you learn from that capstone experience. It could be a portfolio where you're doing, a science investigation and a social science research paper and a literary analysis and a mathematical model. That's what some of the portfolios look like. Might have an internship component, might have an arts component. You've got to be able to score those and then communicate those scores as well as the work to colleges and employers. And that's the piece that is getting developed now, where both requests for a digital portfolio where a college could look at a piece of it in 15 minutes with your transcript, your badges, maybe a 2-minute video of an exhibition, maybe a little piece of writing, but there's a table of contents where they can go in and say, this kid wants to be a science major, let's just look at their science investigation. We're not going to look at it for everybody. We're going to look at it for kids at the margin or kids on particular things. And then being able to maybe accredit those in the way that badging and micro-credentials are moving, where you could look at that body of work. This is what they do in Queensland. It's what Kentucky's getting ready to do on science assessments. And if they are good manifestations of the standards, essentially do what we've done with AP and what we've done with IB, which is to say that score has meaning. So you don't have to see all that IB work when you're at college. You know that that score has meaning. And if you would need an assessment quality assurance system like the UK has, like Queensland, Australia has, to certify that kind of work, to say, yes, it has meaning, it hits a standard, we're going to use it as information in our process. And then, of course, employers can also use these. The National Academies Foundation portfolio is already being used that way. In California, we have a set of 7 districts, including Los Angeles and Oakland and Fresno and some of the other big ones, 37 schools, all developing graduation portfolios. Oakland's going to go wall to wall. Pasadena, a quarter of the high schools in Los Angeles have kids producing these graduation portfolios that the CSU system and the UC system are now trying to figure out how to understand in some way that translates.
Yeah. Salam, when I was in school in Oregon, we had a portfolio, and then it went away, right? What happened there? I don't remember. You don't have to tell me the whole story,
Well,
but
some
just what some of our
places
friends
still-
might want to know.
Were you
Yeah.
in high school in his district?
Yeah.
No, not in his district. I wasn't in his district. So.
So we actually, I mean, Oregon led in the education reform movement with the Oregon Educational Act for the 21st century, and you may recall the SIM and the CAM.
That was what it was called. There you go.
So,
They had to do that.
And we had a proficiency assessment system that some of my colleagues in Oregon here have actually helped us design and develop and implement. But it was considered to be a high-stakes accountability system.
I see.
But student work, student portfolios, we used to performance assessments were a big part of it in writing and math in particular. We used to convene teachers to actually grade students' work, and it was one of the best professional development opportunities we afforded to them, as you mentioned. So I think in this age of trying to make assessments efficient, which really means affordable, which also means cheap, we've moved away from these highly sophisticated, really relevant practices.
Yeah.
So that's what happened,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
answer your question. So,
And do you think, sort of, doesn't that, going back towards some sort of engaging system tied to this opt-out conversation that we had earlier, but I'd be interested in how you're thinking about, you know, in Oregon you have the option to opt out of the test, so how do you keep
Right.
kids in these assessments?
right,
Is it-
right. So when I assumed my role at the State Office of Education, Department of Education in July of 2015, I had the unenviable task of accomplishing 2 things, because we had one key piece of legislation that passed that allows parents to opt out their children from state assessments. And then I had the responsibility of not only inform districts that they had to do this, we had the responsibility of holding them accountable, of informing parents that they have the option to opt their kids out, and we had to provide them the resource materials that they could use to exercise that right. At the same time, we were getting calls from the U.S. Department of Education wanting us to ensure that we have 95% participation. So in the same vein, we would communicate with districts to say, yes, you can opt out, but you have to have 95% participation, so make sure as many kids as possible take the test. So it was a juxtaposed position, but we worked through it. And I think in Oregon, some of the things that were mentioned already by the panel contributed to this decision for allowing students to opt out. And it's the value, it's the relevance, it's the fact that this assessment that we now administer at the end of the school year, so to speak, competed with other priorities that students and parents had. It competed with students taking the SAT, ACT for a second time. It competed with students taking the IP exams or AP exams or preparing to take the AP exam. So there were some logistical reasons why the opt-out became a state discussion, and it's a logical one. So if you ask a kid, you know, should you take the time to prepare for the AP exam or take this assessment that really has no bearing on your outcome as a high school graduate, naturally they're going to want to prepare for the AP or take the AP. So, but then it became a political conversation. At the same time, I think we had this momentum in our state. We had a group of education partners, the State Department of Education, teachers from the Oregon Education Association, our School Boards Association, our COSA, our association that represents administrators, worked together on developing what's called a new path forward, and that was really nested in this notion of a balanced assessment system, which meant a balanced accountability system. So we have many things that culminated in this direction of giving students the option to opt out. But politically, I will tell you that our legislators in particular were hearing from parents. They were hearing from constituents relative to the value of the assessment that we were making students take. And they didn't see relevance, unfortunately. Many things contributed to it, but we worked through it, and we're striving to have a balanced assessment system where summative assessment is part of that. But we don't want to rely completely on the summative test to tell us everything that we need to do and want to do to know about schools and students. And we're redesigning a report card where the summative assessment is part of it, but it's actually a small fraction of the overall accountability score that a school would receive to determine if it's in need of improvement or not. Okay. So we're expanding that conversation to look at multiple measures and multiple indicators of success for students in schools and for accountability purposes.
Did you find out opt-out was higher in the high school?
The opt-out, definitely, absolutely.
Yeah,
It was
that was
primarily
true in California as
yes,
well.
it was primarily at the high school level, and we've had some interesting dynamics there. We had schools where the opt-out rate swung dramatically in one year. Even within the same school district, actually, we have a district in our state that has two high schools. One has like an 87 participation rate, and the other one has a 97% opt-out rate. Wow. So only 3% of the students took the high school assessment. Wow. Same school, same culture, but we found that it really depends on the leadership in that school. So it's the leadership at the district level that makes a tremendous difference, and also the leadership at the school. And we've seen schools swing back that had like a 70% opt-out rate the year before. Last year, they had a high participation rate at 85 and 90%. Yeah. So it all depends on the leadership, but there are many things that actually contribute to it.
So Chris, you've looked at ESSA plans in some detail, I know. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing at high school level for other metrics of success? And Salam, I'll also come back to you and ask, what are you doing in Oregon? Because you talked about multiple measures of high school success. So.
Right. I think largely states are continuing the innovation that they're working on in their accountability systems that was first opened up through the ESSA waivers. Mm-hmm. And I think they're working from that platform with the ESSA systems. In the high school space, certainly there are both state and national measures that are present in many of the state accountability plans. We've seen an emphasis on course taking, which I think is right. So advanced course taking, AP, IP courses, joint enrollment, dual enrollment, lots of opportunities to demonstrate competencies associated with college success or earn college credit while in high school. That's characteristic of many of the accountability plans. An emphasis on career readiness through completion of career pathway courses, industry certification. I think there's a lot more work to do in that area, but I think there's a great lift happening in that area, which is another characteristic of the plans. Frankly, we're not seeing any sort of jaw-dropping indicators in the school quality student success space. I don't think that's because there's not an appetite for it, but I think it's because states are proceeding cautiously, which is certainly a rational decision. Some of the innovation we're seeing is with alternative school accountability models. So for example, I know Wyoming is working on a model that has as part of their system a student success plan, which really is a way to track that students are getting the kinds of experiences that are going to be helpful to propel them to post-secondary success. And I'm interested to see how some of those pockets of innovation will play out in some of the accountability work it might go to scale. But I'll return to this idea, though, that just as summative assessments aren't the end-all reform to improve student achievement nationwide, neither are state accountability systems. So I think these accountability systems are influenced a little bit by some of the assessment fatigue. There's a little bit of accountability fatigue. So I think that we're seeing that folks aren't dumping everything into the model and trying to do everything at once. I think they're creating streamlined systems that have credible measures that will fulfill their pledges in very honest kinds of ways, with a cautious but open idea to continue to innovate in what are smart ways. But that's a bit of a read of what I'm seeing from some of the state systems.
As we're talking, one of the things that's really clear is how different the challenge and the expectations are in the high school versus elementary and middle. You can sort of see why at elementary and middle school you could imagine, some summative assessments along the way that everyone would, that would tell you something about progress that everyone would take, or that would be matrix sampled if we could get to that, et cetera. In the high school, kids are launching into their futures, right? So there's all kinds of testing going on. We've named all kinds of tests, AP, SAT, IB, et cetera. And yet we can't make sense of it, and then we try to put yet another summative assessment in the middle of all that. And so the fact that we've got to think about high school as a launching pad for kids' futures, and that the assessments have to be enabling and useful and reflective of what skills and competencies they're developing. It's just a different problem than what we've got in the elementary grades. And if there were yet an ESSA 2, one might want to suggest that the federal government not mandate what happens in high school and let people work out a way to have thoughtful curriculum.
Don't make me negotiate ESSA again, please. No, I'm having flashbacks. No, we're not doing ESSA 2. But we got a lot of good questions. So, Andrew, first one, I think it's a NAEP question, so can I ask you to answer it? Everybody thinks the fourth and it's a NAEP question. So everybody thinks the 4th and 8th grade NAEP is the gold standard. Why don't we feel the same way about 12th grade NAEP?
Oh, I certainly do.
You do? Okay. Well, that one's out. All right, we're done with that.
I think so again, in grade 12, we don't have a 50-state comparability, and I think that that's one issue. I think there's been some concern about motivation in grade 12. If you look at the studies, however, the motivation doesn't seem to be affecting trends. It may sort of depress overall performance slightly, but maybe no different than any other assessment. That doesn't seem to be changing over time. And if you look at the responses, there's no indication in either self-report or how people are answering questions that there is any changes in motivation over time. I see Jim Popham in the room, and he always says, speaking about how your opt-out fluctuated so dramatically from one year to the other. I think he said it was it's about the adults in the room, right? It's about the leadership that they show, and when the NCES and the good folks at NCES administer NAEP, they now have very clear protocols, and I wish I could recite them, but they are apparently inspiring, as they should be, because this is quite an important task that you're doing, helping us understand how we're making progress in educational achievement over time since the 70s and 80s and 90s. So in any case, I think it still is the gold standard. We should have. In my opinion, we should have more of it. Although I shouldn't speak on behalf of the many other board members who I see in this room. There's Jim and Joe and Lou Fabrizio in the past, and Mitchell Chester, who sadly passed away recently, was also on on the board. And so there are 26 members. I don't speak for all of them, but grade 12, high school is on our agenda in a very clear, important way, highlighted in our strategic vision. And so, and also, so too is partnership. And so I think I mentioned, what do states do well? What does NAGB and NAEP do well? That's a conversation I look forward to continuing to have, because I do think that NAEP and the way NAEP goes about measurement is a very important tool in this toolbox. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it is a very useful tool, and I hope we use it wisely.
Great. Salam, we got two questions that are similar, so I'll group them together here. How were stakeholders in the State Department engaged in making the decision for the flexibility at the high school level? So how did you engage communities? And then second question is, what role should parents play to support and engage the changes happening around high school exams and approaches to these new assessment models? So stakeholder engagement, and also how do we think parents play into that?
That's a great question, because the reason we're headed down this path is because of the feedback that we received from a variety of stakeholders. We conducted over 24 community forums around the state of Oregon. We had a massive stakeholder engagement that involved parents, teachers, educators at every level of the continuum, if you will, policymakers, and we had students in the room, and student voices were very loud and clear that they wanted an assessment that meant something to them. They actually were very mindful of the equity component here too, because they told us, if we offer SAT or ACT, then that is equitable to many of their fellow students that can't afford to pay for the test. But if we also offered SAT or ACT, this will instill in the minds of students that think that they're not eligible to go to college, or in the minds of their families that think their kids are not eligible to college, an opportunity to think about college in a different way. So we had a variety of stakeholders encourage us to explore these new options, and we're in the process of doing that. So there is a technical component to this where the agency staff or the technical advisory committee will be involved in fleshing out the details relative to the RFP and implementation challenges, et cetera. So we'll get to that. But in terms of the overall sentiment that we're hearing from parents, from students, from educators, and from policymakers, quite frankly, that are extremely influential in this conversation, because policymakers, legislators can cause you to go in one direction or another. Mm-hmm. So we're approaching it very methodically, but we intend to continue to engage and solicit feedback and continue the process that we've established already in the early phases of designing our state plan.
Got it. So Linda, your necklace was
Yes.
on your microphone there. So, or maybe it's just somebody back there. I don't know. All right, so next question is around the approach. It's for you, Linda. So are these approaches around assessment that you're discussing change thinking around accommodations for students with disabilities or ELLs? I can't read the writing here, but that's the general sense of the question. So do you think in an environment where kids are producing more project-based things, that we have capstone projects, where do accommodations fit into that as well?
Well, I mean, they fit in as they would in any other kind of assessment. And there's a lot of experience with how to create accessibility for students in these kinds of tests. You have to allow multiple pathways in, and obviously a set of supports for that. Some states got pretty far down that path when they were doing this kind of assessment in the 90s. Other countries have been developing it since then. The Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, SCALE, which is headed by Kenji Hakuda and Ray Pashone, have been really working on performance assessments that are modified for or linguistically supported for English learners. And so there's a lot of kind of knowledge base growing about how to take these kinds of tests and be sure that kids have accessibility. There's also some evidence that both students with disabilities and English learners often do better on tasks where they actually can find their way into the task and work through it, in contrast to being caught by the distractors that are on multiple choice tests. There's always, distractor items, which are there specifically to catch students like them, which often do. So yes, you absolutely have to be very, very vigilant and alert for the kinds of accommodations that are necessary. The other point I just want to make is that often people think of performance tests or assessments as being non-standardized. And people are making them up and they're whatever. There's a lot of this work that's highly standardized. So when you're developing the tests, you pilot them, you field test them. If they're common tasks, you do that with students with disabilities, with English learners, build in the expectations and accommodations for that so that when they are used, it's not just what somebody thought up and threw at a kid, it's really a well-developed assessment tool that is also fair and scoreable and takeable.
Got it. So no, follow up on this accommodation issue. So what are, I'll let anybody answer this. What are your thoughts on accommodation policies of SAT and ACT not matching state policy? Does that make it the wrong tool for accountability?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at this one, Chris. And it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about some work that a group of state leaders through CCSSO is doing to help states respond to this ESSA component that allows for the locally selected national assessment option. And what the state leaders have found in their exploration so far and in their work to develop guidance is there are substantial operational and management issues. So it's more than just the technical criteria, which tends to make the headlines here. And those technical criteria are very important, things like comparability and content correspondence and the like. But these administration criteria, attentiveness to making sure that all accessibility features and accommodations that match the state's policies are going to be offered are there. In addition to a host of other, the states perform a wide swath of services in management of assessment programs, things like investigating improprieties and administration, just managing the contract and the like. And so those are really non-trivial issues that my advice would be to really go slow to go fast and investigating what a path forward is going to be to bring these assessments to the state level if that's a direction that the state decides to go. So I share the view of those who are really concerned that we've got to get these accessibility, accommodations, equity writ large solved in order for this to be a suitable solution in the state accountability system. And there is also this technical issue of how well those assessments are designed, given that they were launched with a different purpose in mind than measuring performance of all kids statewide, right? I mean, they're not designed to be highly sensitive for students across the full distribution of ability. And so those are issues that are non-trivial, and I think it's going to require some real attention in order to bring those assessments to that place.
I totally concur with that, and that's why we're allowing ourselves close to 18 months to really reach that point of selecting something other than what we currently have. And whatever we choose has to meet the criteria that's currently in place. We're looking for something that's better and something that doesn't actually take us backwards. And the issues of accessibility and the test management and administration are things that we want to be able to count on. And we want to be able to afford to all of our students.
Okay, follow up on that, sort of in a similar vein. Given that none of the college entrance exams nor NAEP is aligned to a state's individual standards in ELA, math, science, and/or history, how valid are they as measures of learning when they are not aligned to the student's learning opportunities and school curriculum? And how do you prevent school curricula from just then aligning to those test prep opportunities? So sort of a long question, and there's a lot of assumptions in there. So take on any part of that.
Well, I'll take on the first part. If the test is not aligned to the content standards, then it's not an eligible test for us.
Okay.
So it's really that simple.
So you're going to do, whoever comes back in your high school has to be aligned to your high school standards.
They have to demonstrate that they are aligned and they meet all of the quality criteria that's currently in place.
Got it. Somebody,
on the NAEP front,
Yeah.
the answer is simple: low stakes. Right? So that prevents the sort of the inflation of the NAEP test when it comes to grade 12. And that's a challenge, of course, that you're going to face if it's not aligned. It's classic inflation, inflation 101.
Got it. Question, and I don't know what it's in regards to, so somebody might have to clarify, but what do you anticipate to change substantively with the new US DOE leadership? Well,
That question's for you, Chris.
That's your question, yes.
so I'm asking myself a question, yeah. So I actually think one of the most interesting parts is thinking about how they are going to give feedback to every state plan, ESSA plan, and they sort of had a stance of more flexibility for states, and that's clear that they want to deliver on that. They've also given some more prescriptive feedback than we had anticipated in the first 3 state plans. I think some of that is just a misunderstanding of what states are actually saying. So from my perspective, I don't think much is going to change other than if I was in a state right now, I would be submitting the plan that I want for my state, not worried too much about the feedback you're going to receive, and then do the negotiation with the department. I do think one important FAQ that they did put out was they did note that states may or may not have to respond to the feedback in order to get approved, which was an interesting, and that was a first for me. And I didn't know we were just doing this activity for fun, but that I do think that that leaves some space for states to justify some of the choices they're making as in interacting with U.S. Department of Education. Chris, anything you want to add to that? I mean, you've been in these ESSA plans more than I have, so.
I'm going to try to stay very cautious with my language here.
Yeah.
I think your read is accurate, Chris. I think there was an expectation of flexibility. We're sort of waiting to see that expectation realized. But the statute is, when ESSA was passed, recall, there was this real bipartisan, maybe the last moment I remember there being this kind of bipartisan support, and there was this view that it really represented what various perspectives wanted in the law. And I think now we're getting to the place where the rubber's meeting the road, where we're having to make some hard, the department, the states in negotiating for their plans and their assessment solutions, are having to really unpack this language and having to do that really detailed work of seeing exactly what's statutorily required and where the flexibility resides. And that process is happening right now in real time. And I think it's the devil's in the details. It's going to have to get worked out through that process. My experience with US Ed is these are good faith actors, and I'm optimistic that with smart state leadership and good folks at ED that this can get resolved.
You are ready to run for office. That was very good. The next question's about college readiness frameworks versus career readiness frameworks. So it's a longer question, but the summary of the question is many of the tests have been built on a college readiness framework, and what do we need to do to make sure we're digging in on the career side? And have you seen any promising practices in that area? So anybody can weigh in that would like to on that. If not, I will.
Well, I'll just note that there has been work underway from a number of states. I know Washington State is one. I know California is watching carefully on the career readiness indicators that are associated with the Smarter Balanced assessment. And I think some good work has gone on trying to kind of understand the quantitative reasoning and literacy demands of different career pathways and what that translates into in that regard. But I think in addition to that, there is, of course, a very important budding movement in the career tech arena around certifying industry credentials, certifying capacities that students have, and it does bring, some of that. It's interesting. It's a place where some of the authentic assessments of capacities and skills have been organized in ways that result in a credential, a badge, a micro-credential, an industry credential, where I think we could learn something as well about how to give meaning to those kind of skills that students are developing.
Yeah.
What I would add to that, again, is we find ourselves in a situation where we're looking at a test and we wanted to measure everything.
Yeah.
So it just takes us down different paths. I think when I think of college and career readiness, to a certain degree, they're one and the same. There is a basic core set of skills that we expect all students to know and be able to demonstrate at a certain level to be prepared to enter the workforce or enter a post-secondary institution. In our state, we're seeing a surge of career and technical education and a tremendous investment in career and technical education programs as a high school graduation, as a way to improve graduation, reduce dropout, and increase engagement at the high school level in particular. But also we see investments in STEM as a way to engage students in the learning process and to have more authentic application-based, performance-based type experiences for students. So as we redesign a report card, we're actually looking at reporting on a lot of different indicators of student engagement and student success, but not necessarily calculating those into the accountability formula. So our report card will have a post-secondary success section that looks at the number of college credits that a student earned in high school. It could potentially look at the certification or badges based on manufacturing, et cetera, that students have earned in high school. So we're expanding the categories simply to use the report card in a causation kind of relationship. Yep. So that allows for a different conversation within the community that lets the community to hold the school accountable for what they want to see happening in their school. And again, moving away from this over-reliance on this one test that tells us everything we think we know or we want to know about a school, or how the students that are different and the demographics are changing dramatically in Oregon are doing. So
That's good.
And you're really talking about evidence of accomplishment.
Yeah.
yes.
And so, one of the nice things about ESSA and the multiple measures is so many states are building college and career readiness
Yes.
Indicators of various kinds. You mentioned those as well. And we're starting to have this conversation about, well, what's the evidence of accomplishment?
Right.
Which is what a test is to some extent, but there's a whole lot of other evidence
Yeah.
that people are now being able to
Right,
bring to
right.
the table.
We have business and industry that are engaging with local school districts to develop employability certificates and all kinds of indicators of students' readiness to enter the workforce. And they actually place a greater value on these types of credentials and the process that's associated with that than sometimes the actual state assessment that the student is taking.
Got it.
And the students see the relevance of that
Yeah.
for that next step
Yeah,
in their
that's
life.
good. Next question, I think, is for Andrew, possibly, or Chris. What indicators and accountability systems must SEAs be careful to not reinforce student poverty, is what it says. But I think be careful in using to not reinforce student poverty, specifically in high schools, is what it's asking.
I'm not sure what this is code for, but we had a conversation on Twitter recently about proficiency versus growth and growth to proficiency. And in a high stakes scenario, growth to proficiency is correlated with proficiency metrics on their own, which means that the lower scoring and high poverty schools are likely to be flagged. Right, more in a way that doesn't control for socioeconomic status. So the question always goes back to, again, what are we using this for? Right? Are we going to measure? Growth to honestly report who needs to make the most growth in a formative sense, or are we going to punish or sanction schools that have a lot of growth to make? Right? And actually, I'm here at CCSSO. I should thank you. You're the publisher of my only book, The Practitioner's Guide to Growth Models. Thank you. I feel like I'm coming home. But this goes back to that book, which I thought would be out of date by now, but somehow isn't. And the questions we use growth to ask, right? So that's a general statement on growth to proficiency. But there is a question about, you were talking about, Linda, about the challenges of measurement in high school with respect to 3 through 8, and this you can think of these as Venn diagrams, right? Where 3 through 8, you have a lot of overlapping circles, and in high school you start to have this starts to spread out, and that makes not just measurement of status a challenge; it makes measurement of growth an incredible challenge. I think there's some promising approaches within grades for measuring growth, and across grades there are a number of different tools we can use as well, but they aren't sort of absolute gain-based approaches. So I do think that there are ways to measure in a low-stakes environment. that can be useful for flagging and supporting students and schools that need the most help. But if we take the higher stakes we put in it, you can't let the stakes go past the science, right? And there's a way that if you put really, really high stakes in the measure, then there's a lot of growth-based approaches that are just going to keep punishing over and over again schools that need the most help.
Okay. Chris?
I'll just add to that. I completely agree with Andrew. And obviously the answer is the more you load status in, the more you're going to have these correlations that are going to be strong with demographics and poverty. But it's not just about the indicators, right? So you can have a system that has a great set of indicators, but it's about the design decisions that go into creating some sort of outcome. And NCLB was a good example of that. You could add growth to an NCLB model, but it would have been entirely superfluous because it was a conjunctive model. And so I think states are looking at what indicators should they add in their model, and how can they bring those indicators together to yield decisions about very practical things like classification into CSI and TSI status, and about awarding whatever additional state classifications they have, be those letter grades or stars or smiley faces or whatever the classification system is. And those design decisions matter a lot. And it's a tough thing, Chris, because you have to manage a commitment to equity and wanting to make sure that subgroups really do have some sway in the system, and that the system is designed to detect schools in which subgroup performance needs to be flagged. But you certainly don't want to create a situation where it's just correlated back to poverty, and you've got NCLB all over again. So it's a combination of indicators and these design decisions and performance standards really come together to create what I think are models that work well to discriminate across the range of schools.
And then I think you've got to remember that the standards-based reform idea was set standards, have assessments, flag needs, invest
Sure.
in meeting the needs, right, with the kinds of resources that are both necessary for human capacity building and provision of the materials and everything else. And, you know, we've been through so much emphasis on test-based accountability in the last 10, 15 years, where sometimes it stops at the point of, okay, now we've identified, put the flag on, got the label, maybe we'll blow up the school, maybe we'll fire the teachers, but the investment component of what standards-based reform was supposed to lead to sometimes has gotten forgotten. So I just think it's always helpful to remind ourselves that if we're really interested in ensuring the education of those kids, there's several other steps that we need to undertake.
I call this the paradox of prediction, right? When you're talking about college readiness, right? We have a lot of fancy models these days that can predict whether or not your student or this child is ready for college. Do you want that prediction to be correct? Right? If you predict they're not ready for college, do something about it.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
So we have fancy predictive models, and we haven't thought about what we're going to do in response to them. And so I think that really, as we talk about college and career readiness, it's not about the measurement of it as much as a step towards ultimately increasing it.
And
right?
I just encourage state education department staff, as these things, you know, as these measures produce information, to be always thinking about how to hold that up beyond the edges of the state ed department to the legislature, to the governor, to others who have to correct the inequitable funding systems in the states, who have to make investments in capacity building.
Yeah.
You know, we're becoming more and more unequal. Concentrated poverty is growing. Poverty is growing. Homelessness of children is growing. All those things are happening. 36 states are spending less today than they were in 2008. Federal funds have declined. I mean, we're in a position where you can measure your butt off, but if you don't actually stimulate people to make the investments, kids who live in poverty are still going to fall further and further and further behind.
That's right. So, apologize, we aren't going to be able to get to all the cards that were sent in. Last question for the group here. Our clock stopped, so apparently you have as much time as you want. We're stuck at 2 minutes and 47 seconds left in the session forever. But for 30 seconds or less, what do you think high school testing looks like in 10 years from now? So who wants to start?
Oh my goodness, what does it look like?
We can go down the line if you like. I think if the question is, you know, what do we want? What do we think is really going to produce the kind of impact that we all prize? I think it's capacity building at the local and school and the classroom level. I think the summative assessment, as I said before in this panel discussion, will almost certainly continue to have a role. And I do think it fills that public trust kind of role. But I think if we really want to see the kinds of reforms that we all value, I want to use a word like assessment literacy, but so often that gets mangled a bit, or people understand it very differently. And I don't mean we need people to learn how to calibrate items in a 3-parameter model or do stocking and load equating, right? What I mean is practices, people to understand how to design and score and use results from performance tasks and do nimble real-time assessments in the classroom. I think we invest in those kinds of capacity building, I think will move the needle.
Great. Andrew?
So one possibility that I think would be useful is to have all this local control, but always with some method of comparability somewhere embedded in it, whether it's matrix sampling or whether it's really thoughtful field experiments, so that you can have something like what Sean Reardon and I have done over the past 7 years. So you have this map with state tests overlaid using NAEP as a backbone, right? So that you can actually understand district levels, even school level performance, how we're making progress over time, where are the gaps. We can have that answered while still having, we still have 50 different state, or sort of thereabouts, that many state tests, but we have to have some mechanism, some way to understand whether we're making progress and whether we're closing achievement gaps. So that to me is my non-negotiable. We have to have a way to answer those key questions, even as we have local pockets of innovation.
Linda?
So I guess I want to take both of those ideas and then add something in between. I think NAEP could be, if we really invested in it properly, really could be a comparability mechanism across states in the ways that you described. And maybe we could put that to bed, because we're not going to get comparability across states any other way in terms of just knowing how the country as a whole is doing. And then add to the notion of some local capacity building around these assessments, some common elements, some common tasks that might be part of pathways of curriculum that you really could measure comparably within both a state and a student pathway, a mix that allows for that. And then evolved college admissions tools, which will hopefully resemble more the AP capstone assessments and augmented by evidence of student accomplishments, as we've talked about it, that universities and employers have found a way to receive and utilize.
Great. Salam?
I just build on what Linda just shared. I think we talked backstage about a system of assessment, and I don't think we mentioned it enough in our conversation. And I think that's really what's lacking in our country, in our state. I'll speak for Oregon, because we tend to treat assessments as isolated events that happen to students, that happen to us. And we really need to think about truly telling students what they know and what they don't know, and what their skill level is, and how prepared they are for that next grade or to go to post-secondary institution. We still have these outrageous rates of remediation that are taking place. We have a large number of students going into developmental education, and we need an assessment that tests and validates whether they have the knowledge and skills to be successful in that next step. And maybe we need a different assessment for accountability, or from that we can tease out the accountability. But we truly need a system of assessment that places learning at the center of everything that we do and answers that question, the why question, for students and their parents. And most importantly, our educators, they have to buy into it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
that's where you're going.
My dream.
That's where you're going. Good. Please join me in thanking these folks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so this is the last time we'll be together in this room. We have another day or so of the conference left. So I just want to thank you on behalf of CCSSO for all of your attendance, and the presentations that I've been to have been really, really great. And I know we're learning a lot about what we're going to do in the States to respond to these things like high school assessments. And I went to a science assessment presentation this morning. I just feel like we're really identifying and sharing important topics that hopefully you can use back in the States and back in the school districts across this country. So thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.